Welcome back everyone for another video. Today I want to go over my top 5 meta surprises for the BT9 format. These are going to be decks that either overperformed or underperformed throughout the format to a lot of people's expectations. Anyway, let's get started. For the 5th biggest surprise on my list, I want to talk about Grandest Gugamon. This is a deck people hyped up to be one of the best decks in the format. I personally didn't think this was going to be the case. I saw that green still had a lot of inconsistency issues, and that really showed up to be the case. Even though this deck has a lot of power in its ability to clear an entire security stack, delete multiple threats, while also setting up a pseudo ice wall type of effect, it really has a lot of problems in one, green being inconsistent, on top of its heavy weakness to security bomb type cards. These two crutches to the deck really kind of kept it only in the tier 1.5 status. It's still a threat as it's able to have really strong, successful games. It just doesn't have the consistency or durability to handle some of the threats in this format, only leaving it at the 1.5 slot. That's why it's my 5th biggest surprise for this format. For my 4th slot on this list, I want to go over Belstarmon. Belstarmon was expected to be one of the best anti-meta picks going into the format, as it has a lot of good options and threats that deal with OTK stacks. Cocytus Breath being a very strong option to stop most OTKs, as well as the other sleuth of removal options Belstar has. This built up with the Gugamon and the Vilemon blocker, allowing you to stop some of their memory gain and attacking threats. This deck was looking to be a really strong threat, but this deck really hasn't performed in this format. And that's because I personally highly underestimated how badly the inconsistencies of this deck would harm it. In long events, the inconsistent parts of this deck really bring the deck down and prevent it from performing at a high level. On top of this, Alphamon decks, one of the decks that counters the most, is starting to put in more answers to the threats Belstar is presenting. While going into the form of this deck was looking to be one of the best anti-meta threats, it really just hasn't performed at that level, and that's why it is the 4th biggest surprise on this list. For the 3rd biggest surprise on the list is a deck that has really overperformed this format, being able to take at least one top 16 in almost every event once people have solved the list, and that deck is going to be Commandramon. Commandramon has been a deck since basically the beginning of the game, but hasn't really performed at a high level. It always has inconsistencies and still has some of those, but a lot of the things that got this format really are working in its advantage. It is able to play really strong security bombs such as Iron Fisted Onslaught, Congo, and Ultimate Flare, allowing it to deal with some of the big threats that come out this format, as well as the new EX2 Tamer that allows it to draw and cycle through its engine while also fueling its resources for Darkdramon. This deck has a lot of gas, but to help this deck compete in the late game, it also is one of the decks that is able to use Death X to its fullest potential. The Commandramon engine puts a lot of pressure, forcing a lot of opponents to bring their threats out to deal with them, which means it fuels the Death X ability to lower its cost, making this deck really solid against other mid-range or aggro decks. And you can also Digivolve on top of the Darkdramon if you need be. This deck has a lot of different options, and while it doesn't always do a ton, it has a very consistent game plan with 20 rookie builds that allow it to consistently put on pressure while having these late game bombs such as Darkdramon and Death X. That's why this deck gets my number 3 slot on this list. For the 2nd biggest surprise of this format is a deck that's really been taking names in a lot of events recently. This is the Greymon Gaimon deck. This deck has really surprised a lot of people, as it was expected by most people to be a low tier 2 deck, but is really showing up to be one of the best decks in the format. People thought this deck was going to be a little too slow to really compete in this format, but even though it does have issues with being slow, if it's able to set up its game plan fast enough, it really is hard to break through. It has one of the best defensive cores, using the Greymon blocker to prevent attacks, the Greymon X to prevent that Digimon from being deleted or removed, the Black War Greymon able to remove other people's setup, Gugamon being able to swing with the Blitz ability, and the Metal Greymon Inheritable allows it to swing it unsuspended. You really can't keep threats on the field against this deck. This deck gives the deck the strongest late game of almost any deck in the format, and as long as they're able to commit to their defensive playstyle, build up this stack without threatening their own Digimon, it's really hard to get through this deck. It still has problems being slow, which is why it's not the best deck in the format, but if it's ever able to set up, this deck is definitely a menace you have to deal with. That's why it gets my number 2 slot on this list. But for my biggest surprise of the format is a deck no one saw coming. This deck managed to take the first 2 events of this format, and that is Mother D Reaper. Mother D Reaper was thought to be dead in the water going into the OTK format, but it turns out that the X antibody bot option, being able to work with all of Mother's effects, especially the Gatekeeper, allowing you to accelerate it out even faster, as well as the Death X to give the deck even more control tools to deal with other people's boards, really pushed this deck to a level people were not expecting. While it hasn't done a ton in recent events, maybe securing maybe 1 or 0 tops in a lot of the most current events, it still was a threat you have to be aware of and build your deck around. I think the rise of the Black or Greymon deck really is one of the biggest issues for this deck right now, but this deck is still a house and definitely surprised a lot of people by being able to take those first 2 events and still able to get some tops here and there. If your deck isn't able to answer the Mother engine, your deck is just dead in the water if you run into this deck. It is an inevitable threat that is able to build up this really strong OTK condition while also not even having to go for the OTK if you can just win straight off of Gatekeeper, basically making your game plan nullified. This deck definitely blew a lot of people's expectations and is definitely something you have to keep in check when you go into the deck building, and gives it the #1 slot on biggest surprises of the BT9 format. So that's my list. These are the biggest surprises, some decks that have underwhelmed and a lot of decks that overperformed throughout this format. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, make sure to do the YouTube thing down below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.